Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Candice Creasman Mowrey, and this is Antiracist Counseling Supervision. So I'll start just by introducing myself a little bit. I own Creasman Counseling, which has offices in Raleigh, Durham, and New Bern, and I've been supervising for, since 2016. And I, like a lot of other supervisors and providers, have been really frustrated by how little information there is about adapting supervision to include or even center concepts of antiracism and activism. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how we can piece together the existing literature on multicultural supervision and add this extra layer of antiracism so that our supervision really serves both our supervisees in their multiple and intersecting identities and their clients. So first, we're going to start by just reviewing some of the current practices in multicultural supervision, and we're going to highlight some of the strengths and the weaknesses. Then we're going to talk about ecological approaches to building anti-racist awareness and efficacy. And ecological models really have a lot to offer in terms of addressing contextual, systemic issues as they relate to supervision. And then we're going to look at some concrete supervision skills and techniques to build on anti-racist principles. And then finally, we're going to look at ways that we can commit to advocacy and activism and resources for ongoing growth in these areas. Okay, so let's start just by defining what we even mean by multicultural supervision in a modern context. So this is definitely a mouthful of a definition, but multicultural supervision is defined by multiple authors as the process through which supervisors can support examining attitudes and beliefs, knowledge, skills, and actions regarding how singular and multiplistic, privileged and marginalized identities, such as race, disability, nationality, affectional orientation, social structures, which includes laws and politics, and social ecological systems. So these are micro, macro, and chronosystems. Influence the counseling and supervisory processes, relationships, and stakeholders. So just take a moment to reflect here. Did anyone feel like they got a concrete set of skills for understanding how to implement multicultural supervision? The answer may be yes for you, in which case that's amazing. But for a lot of folks who are coming from existing CACREP accredited programs, there really is not a lot of very intentional and specific information about how to bring multiculturalism into supervision. So there has been some effort, though, to operationalize multicultural supervision, and two components of what is considered quote unquote successful supervision are broaching and multicultural orientation. And here, success is being defined by ratings of supervisee comfort, particularly when that is stratified by race, openness with a supervisor, and the supervisee's perception, as well as the supervisor's perception of the supervisee's growth. So let's break these down a little bit. I'm actually going to start with broaching. So our working definition of broaching comes from Day Vines back in 2007. She and her colleagues coined this term to refer to the counselor's deliberate and intentional efforts to discuss those racial, ethnic, and cultural, sometimes referred to as REC, concerns that may impact the client's presenting concerns. So one issue around broaching and the research is that most of the research has focused on the client and counselor dyad and not the supervisor-supervisee relationship. So Dr. Kelly King and colleagues sought to bridge this gap in the research by exploring relationships between a multicultural orientation, which we'll break down in just a moment, the Supervisory Working Alliance, and the supervisee's use of cultural behaviors with their clients. So interestingly, supervisees rated themselves more highly on behaviors such as broaching than their supervisors did. So what this points to is that counselors, supervisees may be conceptualizing cultural factors, but not engaging in observable behaviors that reflect this multicultural orientation. So another major finding that we're going to kind of pull on throughout the rest of this conversation was that cultural humility contributed to the majority of the variance in the supervisee working alliance ratings. So there are some weaknesses with this research and other research that has tried to look at multiculturalism within the supervisor relationship. So much of the research focuses on university supervisors and practicum or internship students. So that means that the data we get from these studies reflects really early stages of both supervisor and counselor development. And we really don't have an understanding of what these processes might look like in more established counselors and supervisors. Most of these really lack direct consideration of intersectionality. So they may focus on race, but leave out race plus gender identity plus sexuality, for example. And unfortunately, none so far actual detail strategies, processes, or developmental models for anti-racist supervisory practices. Okay, so that's what we know about broaching. So now let's switch over to multicultural orientation. So this has been conceptualized as a way of being versus a way of doing, which I think is a really critical distinction, because I think we have really come to understand multiculturalism as a verb, which really, I think, misses some of the depth and the internal processes that need to go into being effective in a multicultural way. So this notion of a multicultural orientation really offers a clear philosophical and structural alternative to multicultural competence. So we can break multicultural orientation down into three parts. So the first is cultural humility, and this is a stance of openness to, curiosity about, and respect for the client's salient cultural identities. Then it also includes cultural comfort, which is characterized by an ease in interacting with diverse clients and an ability to engage a client's various identities in a fluid and relaxed and a non-threatened, non-defensive manner. And then finally, we have cultural opportunities. So these are openings or invitations during counseling to directly explore a client's cultural identities and heritage. And so this is essentially a behavioral expression of cultural humility. So we're going to really pull in some more information and dig in a bit more to cultural humility, because we can kind of see how this serves as like a foundational quality for both comfort and opportunities. Okay, so if we consider what is missing from our current understanding of multicultural supervision, it's antiracism. So Cartwright and colleagues noted in 2021 that although some supervision models do mention cultural competence and personal growth and clinical training, there are currently no supervision models that focus on systemic change, dismantling racist practices, and supervisee development. So if we don't have a working understanding or definition of antiracism within the counseling literature, then we have to go outside of the counseling literature to really understand how we might incorporate these principles into our supervision work. So Ibram X. Kendi highlights that there really is no space between racist and anti-racist. So he presents a very dualistic understanding of antiracism. So you are either acting from one space or from the other. And I love this quote, the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. The difference is that one endorses either the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist, or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. And he goes on to say one either allows or confronts racial inequities. And so as we move into our consideration of anti-racism in a counseling context, we're going to lean really heavily on the key aspects of this definition, which involve beliefs, behaviors, and then also this orientation to racial inequities, so whether we allow or confront. And we're going to look at this from both privileged and minoritized racial identities. Okay, so the remainder of our work today is going to be to explore what it looks like to blend a multicultural orientation to supervision with anti-racism as the primary foundation. So first, we're going to look at the water that we are all swimming in, which are these extra personal factors. So this includes considering the ways that white supremacy influences various institutions and systems that uniquely impact counseling and supervision. So then we're going to go from real zoomed out to real zoomed in, and we're going to look at intrapersonal factors, factors within the individual. And we're going to consider both barriers to multicultural orientation and anti-racism, as well as the strategies to enhance these qualities. And then we're going to look at some factors within the supervisor-supervisee relationship that promote a multicultural orientation and anti-racism in our supervisees. Okay, so first let's take a look at the institutional barriers that are within counselor education. So we're starting with microsystems, and then we're going to look at macrosystems. So I think one of the most obvious issues within counselor education as an institution is that our multicultural training often, not in all programs, but very often, is siloed rather than being integrated into all the coursework. So we have this very distinct multicultural class, and then we may or may not engage with the other information in our other coursework with an eye toward identity and privilege and oppression. So if we zoom out a little bit, just higher education academic models, period, the way that these institutions conceptualize success really center attainment of knowledge and skills, but a multicultural orientation and anti-racism really don't fit into that model. I mean, if I could grade someone based on their willingness to confront their privilege, I would, but that framework does not exist within our current academic models. So then we'll look at counselor and counselor educator training and supervisory training. This often centers whiteness, right? So this perpetuates the myth of sameness, that all counselors are the same, and that all counselors have the same learning curves regarding identity. So now we're going to look at another kind of zoomed out layer, which are the systemic barriers to equity and inclusion within mental health. So I think a really great example of the lack of multiculturalism and anti-racism within mental health includes diagnosis and particular identities, right? So certainly there is a really complicated relationship between the DSM and our understanding of gender. So historically within the field of mental health, female identified folks have largely had those identities pathologized, right? So hysteria was one of the first working definitions, and it basically pathologized what were at the time considered to be feminine characteristics. Then certainly transgendered folks, their entire gender identity has been pathologized as a disorder. If we look at race, certain behavioral disorders are often way overdiagnosed in Black and brown children, particularly boys. So these children are diagnosed because they are disruptive, quote unquote disruptive, and these diagnoses lack any actual exploration of how intergenerational trauma might manifest. And then we can even go on to physical disabilities. So within the mental health field, measures of intelligence, of processing, they really don't take into account communication differences. So I'm thinking about folks with autism. I'm thinking about folks with cerebral palsy, who are often assumed to be of lower intelligence because the way they speak may be different. And then another example is folks of indigenous heritage. We know that substance use diagnoses, the rates are extremely high within these populations, but the diagnosis and the treatment from a Western mental health perspective does not address the ongoing trauma of colonialism. So this is something that when we go into the interpersonal factors and we're considering how we can orient our supervisees to anti-racist principles, diagnosis is a really powerful way to go about that. And I'll hopefully remember to mention it then too, but we can prompt our supervisees to consider what is the potential impact of a diagnosis when we consider a person's intersecting identities. Okay, and lastly, at the microsystem level, bias and racism within medicine, which encapsulates mental health and counselor education, our most basic notions of what health even is, carry identity-based stigma. So, for example, the BMI, which is often used as some sort of gold standard metric for health, the data we have about that norms white, thin male bodies, and then essentially pathologizes all other bodies, particularly bodies of color. Okay, so if we zoom out again and we move on to macro systems, I love Resmaa Menakem's quote here. It really, I think, encapsulates what is going on in our macro systems. He writes that the Black body sees the white body as privileged, controlling, and dangerous. The white body sees itself as fragile, vulnerable, and Black bodies as dangerous, needing to be controlled, yet also as potential sources of service and comfort. So on a macro system level, the white body beliefs become enshrined in law and social processes. So an example of this is the war on drugs, which absolutely targets people of color and communities that are under-resourced. The 13th Amendment that perpetuates the capture, containment, and conscription of Black men. So these examples demonstrate how social norms and legislative actions create social separateness and an unequal distribution of resources. So that's where capitalism comes in. And effectively, all of these systems maintain the white body beliefs about what is good, what is necessary, what is beautiful, what is safe. So that is effectively a really oversimplified sample of the swamp water that we are swimming in. Okay, so now we're going to, as I mentioned, we're going to zoom in real hard here. So now we're going to shift from these external social factors to intrapersonal factors. So if we think back to the components of a multicultural orientation, we identified cultural humility, cultural opportunities, and cultural comfort. And so while they are all interconnected, we actually have some data around how to cultivate cultural humility. So in a recent concept analysis of cultural humility that included professionals across health and mental health disciplines, this was by Ferranda and colleagues in 2016, this research identified 5 key attributes of cultural humility. So the first was openness. And this is when the practitioner demonstrates an open mind, is open to engaging in cross-cultural interactions, and is open to new ideas just generally. It also includes self-awareness. So the practitioner has an awareness of their own strengths, their limitations, their values, their beliefs, their behavior. And what I think is also really critical, they have an awareness of how they might appear to others. And then also we have egolessness. So this is not necessarily from like a Buddhist standpoint of no self, so much as it is when the practitioner displays humbleness and modesty and believes that all people are equal. Next, we have supportive interaction. And this is when the practitioner engages in interactions with others that do, in fact, result in positive exchanges. And then finally, self-reflection and critique. So this is where the practitioner is willing to engage in a continual process of reflecting on aspects of self through deep introspection. So these are the faculties, the qualities, the attributes that we want to be able to enhance to increase our capacity for cultural humility. So in digging into this a little bit deeper, there's a Zen proverb that I both love and am intensely annoyed by, which is that obstacles to the path are the path. So while I find that frustrating often, there is also a lot of wisdom in this concept. So we're going to bring that spirit of purposefulness and curiosity to the intrapersonal work. So cultivating cultural humility requires us to examine what may be blocking the attributes. So certainly we want to engage in activities and behaviors that enhance these qualities, but what I have found most often, both in myself and in clients and in supervisees, is that enhancing any quality often requires a really close and clear look at what is blocking those qualities. So this work is going to look different depending on your lived racial experience. So I have this graph, this diagram, which is intended to kind of highlight some of the distinct work that may, heavy emphasis on may relate to particular racial identities, but that also shows the spaces of overlap where we sort of all have similar work to do. And I will just name that this graph is very reductive, so it will by no means capture the complexity of what it's like to contact humility through a racial lens. But I am identifying some recurring themes that show up in both identity development and anti-racist literature. So first we'll look at white-bodied folks, and I identify as a white person. So we will likely need to work with what I summarize as shadow. So this is a Jungian concept, and the shadow basically encompasses aspects of the self that we would deny for fear of being judged or ostracized or punished. And so in the context of white supremacy and white-bodied individuals, we're talking about fear of the Black body. We're talking about feelings of indignation when Black or brown people achieve, surpass, or challenge us. It might be a sense of entitlement to having what we want, especially if we feel like we have worked really hard for that something. And then it could be more basic emotions like greed, rage, hate. I think this aspect of encountering shadow is especially important to promote in our supervisees because as counselors, as helpers, we may be uniquely distant and disconnected from some of these internal experiences because these feelings and beliefs really don't align with our helper identities. So we may have buried them very deep. And so it's going to take some real deep introspection to get at them. So next we'll look at the unique challenges for biracial folks. So they may experience more privilege than darker presenting Black and African American folks, but they may also have the unique challenge of feeling a sense of belonging. So some of the experiences that are often encountered by biracial folks include racial and ethnic stereotypes. So society tries to code them as something, and often there are incorrect assumptions that a person is Muslim and therefore a threat. They may be labeled exotic, foreign, sexualized as a function of these assumptions. And so the interpersonal task here, when we experience an intense sense of othering, especially when that othering can happen across multiple racial identities, right? So often biracial folks will report, I'm not white enough for white people and I'm not Black enough for Black people. So if we're going to grow cultural humility, then we may need to work to integrate multiple racial identities. And then for Black and African American people, there is likely the work of addressing racial trauma. And I say likely because everyone is at a different space and place in terms of how they identify their racial experience, whether they have internalized that as significant trauma, as like a micro trauma. So again, this is very reductive, but it's just kind of a general idea. So we know that racial trauma is a discrete form of trauma. And I love David Archer's quote here. This comes from Antiracist Psychotherapy. He says, racial trauma is a complex form of trauma. It is not just post-traumatic. It is also reinforced in the present at the interpersonal and nervous system level. And I really emphasize here the nervous system level aspect of it. So if trauma is a neurological experience of anticipating harm, and on the other side of this trauma is my capacity for openness and egolessness and all these cultural humility factors, then integration of this trauma is going to require that I have some sort of neuroception of safety. And for Black and African American people, experiencing safety within an ongoing violent system is obviously very challenging. And I'm not going to pretend to have answers for that. Okay, so this is, again, just a very sort of superficial summary of the work that we might have to do based on various racial identities. And then I'll just highlight that awareness of beliefs, biases, and judgments, and self-compassion, that's the work we all have to do. And we're going to speak to that next. So how can we work with these interpersonal pieces? In her book, Mindful of Race, Ruth King discusses the role mindfulness can play in addressing racial beliefs and harm. She says that mindfulness is the practice of present moment awareness with an understanding that what we are aware of has a nature. Okay, nothing is permanent, personal, or perfect. So in this way, mindfulness can be this tool for getting at the barriers to cultural humility, as well as getting more in touch with some of the racial beliefs we have and potentially some of the harm that we may have perpetuated. And so in this book, she brings this frame to the work of confronting white body supremacy and experiences of racial harm. She also has another great quote, which is that racial distress is real and how we relate to racial distress is a habit. So this is where we walk that very fine line between acknowledging that the racism that people of color experience is absolutely real and harmful, and we try to find that workable space internally where we can cultivate some resilience, where we can integrate trauma. And so obviously that is very delicate work because we don't want that to turn into victim blaming or to convey some sort of belief that the trauma is really just sort of in their head and they can reframe it and it'll be fine. So something to be aware of. Okay, so let's look at the ways specifically that mindfulness can touch into some of those qualities of cultural humility. So mindfulness helps us to grow self-compassion, which was one of those shared attributes for managing some of the barriers to cultural humility. It can help us with regulation. And again, this is thinking about regulation on a nervous system level. So it really helps us to engage that parasympathetic nervous system to contact some sense of safety. It can help with co-regulation. So if we are regulated as supervisors, we heighten the chance that our supervisees will also regulate along with us. Mindfulness also helps us to become aware of patterns. Again, and this could very directly apply to patterns of racial harm, patterns of white body supremacy that we enact either internally or externally. And related to that regulation piece, mindfulness can help us respond versus react. And lastly, and what I almost think is kind of most important, is that mindfulness can really allow us to contact loving kindness, which, if that is a part of the container that we are bringing to our supervisory experiences, it just ultimately enhances our connection and openness to our supervisees. So additional benefits of mindfulness include increased empathy and being more flexible in our responses. So we can kind of see how if we can be flexible, if we can have an increased sense of empathy, all of these things will function to increase our cultural humility, increase our capacity for anti-racist engagement. So I have 3 very basic recommendations for folks who are new to mindfulness. So this may not speak as much to folks who have an established mindfulness practice, but the first recommendation is to start with an object, with a mindfulness object that is very simple. Often we are encouraged in Western mindfulness teachings and practices to only focus on the breath. The breath can be a wonderful object to keep us grounded, to get us connected to the present moment. This will not work for everyone. It will be particularly challenging for folks who have any history of panic disorder, any history of anxiety, and certainly if they have some history of trauma. The breath could actually create an activation of some of those trauma responses. So if the breath works for you, great. If it doesn't work for you, that doesn't mean mindfulness is not for you. So alternative objects that we can use include sound, physical sensations. So we can, connect to the sense of touch. We can connect to things that we see. So that's another assumption that I find a lot of people have, is that you have to have your eyes closed to be an effective meditator or mindfulness practitioner. And that is just not the case. So if you want to dig deeper into how to engage in mindfulness in a way that really does take into account some of these personal differences in terms of experience, I highly recommend David Treleaven's book. It's called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And he also really brings in some very solid contextual, systemic, and institutional aspects of how to engage in trauma sensitive mindfulness. Okay. So when you feel like you have been encountering your object and you can kind of focus on it for a little while without as many thoughts and distractions, we're always going to have thoughts and distractions. But when you feel like you've kind of gotten that a little bit, then you can potentially move into loving kindness or metta mindfulness practices. So these practices, and there are a ton of them, you can Google them. And see which ones you like. They basically help us to really intentionally grow our neurological capacity for compassion, both for self and for others. And then my last recommendation around mindfulness is get a teacher. So I spent a good 10 years sitting cross-legged for various intervals and was just white knuckling my way through the meditation. So I was just having this very clinical, removed encounter with all the things that would show up. And then I got involved with in my case, a Buddhist group and a teacher. And it was only then that I was able to realize that I was missing one of the key components, which is compassion. Ironically, the counselor was not able to contact compassion for herself. So that has dramatically changed my meditation practice. So I recommend that, whether it's through a Buddhist center, whether it's through a secular mindfulness-based center, which they do exist. I definitely encourage you to find someone or some community that allows you to engage mindfulness, but don't do it alone. Okay, so now we're going to shift into interpersonal tasks. So here we're going to look at some strategies that we can use that embody this multicultural orientation and anti-racism within our supervisor-supervisee relationships. And then we're going to look at some other ways to conceptualize relationships between the other stakeholders, like the supervisee's clients, for example. So a really key aspect of anti-racism is identifying and naming power differentials, and then taking collaborative steps to reduce those gaps. So we're going to look at that as a piece. And then we're going to look at both the supervisee-supervisor dyad and the supervisee-client dyad. So that way we can explore some more nuanced ways, particularly to support our supervisees of color. So cross-racial supervision has some attention in the literature, but again, not a lot of concrete data to suggest what or how to do it. Okay, so some very specific interpersonal tools. I'm going to start with co-creating the container. So in thinking about acknowledging power, the most predominant aspect of this is really just acknowledging that as supervisors, we serve a really important but unequal power when it comes to gatekeeping around the profession. So we essentially make or break whether a supervisee is able to enter the field. And so just naming that dynamic is, I think, really important. So the next thing that I found to be really useful is exploring previous supervisory experiences. I've had a lot of supervisees. It seems kind of odd, but it's definitely been a trend for me. A lot of supervisees who are from marginalized communities and who start supervision with me after having had really damaging experiences with former supervisors. So I have found it to be really critical to walk through past experiences so that we can clarify expectations, so that we can identify problematic beliefs that were reinforced, and so we can unpack the dynamics of that past supervisory relationship in an intersectional identity-based way. And obviously we want to be mindful of that, often fine line between supervision and therapy. But it is so important, I think, to validate when supervisees have been harmed in previous supervisory relationships. So related to previous supervisory relationships, potentially, is bringing awareness of racial trauma. So consistent across the research on cross-cultural supervision between white supervisors and BIPOC supervisees is that racial disconnections absolutely happen. And they tend to result in less disclosure from the supervisees, and they reduce the supervisory alliance. So what is often reported by supervisees of color in these studies includes microaggressions, minimizing racial distress, or missing the systemic component of racial distress altogether. There is some research starting to come out that's detailing how to help supervisees when they experience microaggressions from clients. So two things that we can do as supervisors across racial identities for our BIPOC supervisees is, number one, explore the supervisee's experience of racially different clients. So we're going to directly ask about microaggressions, microassaults, microinvalidations. And then we also want to be aware of indicators that a racial trauma response has been activated. So the emphasis there is on racial trauma response, because a racial trauma response will look different than a traditional standard white-centered trauma response. So just an example, Black and African American women have the stressors of being targets for racial violence, discrimination, being required or asked to do additional caregiving within their workplaces often. And they're also conditioned that any display of emotion could be perceived as a threat. Okay, so here we might see from a supervisee who is actually in a racial trauma response, there may be a flattening of affect. There may be kind of just a distancing from the content, especially from the emotionality of any content. So being aware of racial stressors for our supervisees can also include exploring the cultural dynamics at their workplace. So this could be related to representation. This could be related to the need for code switching. Again, I'll highlight for female supervisees of color. We might also want to explore what the culture is around professionalism, since so many aspects of Black and African American identity have been labeled essentially as unprofessional. And so next we'll look at creating a supervision plan that actually includes activism. So I don't know if all K-CREP schools use that universal disposition, skills, knowledge, competency assessment as a clinical evaluation during internship, but that is the one I am most familiar with. And there's literally one question that has the word advocacy in it. And it asks if the student engages in advocacy for the profession. So only for the profession. So when you and your supervisee are creating goals like improving assessment and diagnosis skills or enhancing case conceptualization skills, we can also ask, how are you going to actively work toward equity, either for a particular client population or within the profession, maybe and within the profession. Okay, so now we're going to switch into experiential learning. So these are some techniques that we can actually use that embody this multicultural orientation in anti-racism. So I've got first listed here dialectical behavior therapy. And two of my favorite aspects of DBT to incorporate into supervision are dialectical thinking and the DBT hierarchy for treatment targets. So dialectical thinking is effectively finding the kernel of truth in opposing viewpoints. So one of the prompts that we might use to explore a person's experience, opinion, or behavior is to ask, what else? What are we missing? So this can absolutely be applied to client conceptualizations, to bias. We can, help the supervisee explore, what are we missing about this client's identity? Or are there some judgments or assumptions that are hidden in how we are thinking about this client that it might be helpful to name out loud? And then the DBT hierarchy for treatment targets is something that I use to structure all of my supervision because I have found it to be so useful. So the hierarchy itself has 3 levels. Level 1 is self-harm or suicidality. Level 2 is therapy or therapist interfering behaviors. And then level 3 includes quality of life concerns and just sort of general consultation issues. So within supervision, level 2 is where we can address supervisee bias, racial trauma activation, hesitancy around broaching, or any other factors that are related to identity that could be a blind spot for the supervisee and therefore getting in the way of treatment. I actually had a great conversation with the supervisee once. She labeled this a level 2 concern. So she's working in a college setting and it's very competitive. And a lot of her clients were coming to her because of the stress associated with being in this really competitive environment. And so she felt like it was potentially therapy interfering, that she was a part of this system that was creating mental health issues for her clients. So that was also a really great entry point to talk about ways that she could be more of an advocate, that she could engage in more activism around that systemic issue. So you can also use level 2 to address disconnections in the supervisor-supervisee relationship. So for example, you could put yourself, the supervisor, as a level 2. Let's say you were late submitting a quarterly report. So then you would process the impact that this had on the supervisee. You would explore what they need from you in order to make a repair. So this is a really great way of modeling both humility and of sharing power. Okay, so I put acceptance and commitment therapy and internal family systems together, not because they are terribly similar in practice, but because the supervision target is really the same for both. Okay? They both offer a way of encountering distressing internal experiences as an object to be observed. So in acceptance and commitment therapy, there are 6 core processes, and 2 are really relevant to this conversation. So self as context is the first process, and this is encountering the self as the space in which experiences happen. So the self is not the experience, it's the space where it happens. And then the second core process is cognitive diffusion. And this is about reducing our identification with problematic cognitive patterns. Okay. So both of these processes, again, they create space around distress. And that distress could be defensiveness around, a supervisee's called out for some bias. They're clearly getting defensive. Okay, let's notice what it feels like to be defensive right now. We contact that from a space of curiosity rather than being really kind of in the grips of it. Internal family systems uses parts language to create that space. And so from an IFS perspective, we want there to be space between the self and what are called extreme parts. So the extreme parts might be managers, they might be firefighters, they might be exiles. And you don't necessarily need to be extensively trained in either approach to use these frameworks in a supervisory context, because we're not doing deep therapeutic work with these ideas. So the goal is really just to find a way for supervisees to touch into shadow parts that hold bias, or to touch into parts that have been activated through racial harm. And we want to be able to do that without creating a disconnection, without, shame spiraling, or without flooding from a trauma-based perspective. So next we have micro interventions. And these are strategies that were originally conceptualized by Daryl Sue to help counselors address client experiences of microaggressions. So a recent study by Bronco and colleagues explored how these microinterventions could be used to address microaggressions against the counselor by a client. So there are two parts to this from a supervisory perspective. So the first is ensuring that supervisees are actually capable of using microinterventions with their clients to sort of call out those microaggressions. And the second is providing external validation to those supervisees, so they are not shouldering the burden of working through those microaggressions alone. So microinterventions themselves really involve using very basic helping skills to make the invisible visible. So really just naming, okay, here's the assumption or the judgment that seems to show up in that statement, to disable the microaggression. So we're going to pause around it so that we don't just let it linger and cause further harm, and then educate the offender. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on the how, because the original article, which is included in the references, it actually breaks these down really well by using case vignettes. And this article is accessible even if you don't have any sort of academic affiliation. So I definitely encourage you to visit that. So external validation, this is probably the most direct supervisory intervention. And this is where the supervisor provides space for metabolizing whatever may have been activated. So some questions for reflection that we might include that would basically start this validation process is one, just the simple question of how are you feeling at that moment when the client said this? Next, and this is my favorite one, is if you could have said anything you wanted to the client in that moment, without regard for client welfare, what would you have said? And I love this one because it helps new counselors in particular encounter some of those judgments and expectations that they may have around only having unconditional positive regard for their clients, right? So this really helps to demonstrate that counselors, we're allowed to feel some negative things about our clients. Like feeling a feeling, having a thought is not inherently harmful, but having those thoughts and having those feelings without awareness is how it turns into a disconnection within the session, and maybe even a problematic behavior within the session. So another strategy for validating the experience is to explore previous experience of microaggressions, maybe considering how the supervisee has historically skillfully or unskillfully addressed those experiences. I very often with supervisees will ask, does this feel familiar? Because generally, if something is getting activated for someone, it's because it's not the first time they've encountered it. So again, fine line, supervision, therapy, but acknowledging patterns, we know that that is a really powerful tool for enhancing cultural humility. So we want supervisees to really kind of get in the habit of doing this. And then lastly, case conceptualization is a really powerful tool. Intentional case conceptualization is a powerful tool for integrating multicultural orientation and anti-racism, because this really requires the supervisee to engage with cultural opportunities, because you can't do a multicultural sort of intersectional conceptualization without having that information about the client. So we're required. That helps us as supervisors to see how do supervisees get this information about their clients. So a model for this is Pamela Hayes' addressing model of cultural identity. So when you're talking through cases or you're watching tape, This gives you an idea and an opportunity to see which identities the supervisee broached, what level of broaching they used, and to see how they were able or not able to integrate concepts of power and privilege around these identities. Okay, so I will circle back. Another really powerful way within this case conceptualization format to integrate particularly anti-racist ideas is, again, to consider the impact of particular diagnoses around particular identities. Okay, so if we again come back to sort of how we might build extra personal tools to address these microsystems and macrosystems, this water that we're all swimming in, we have to consider activism and advocacy. I worked on a study with Dr. King and Vanessa Soleil after the summer of 2020, and it found that counselors who were involved in an anti-racist action group, most of whom identified as white, they were willing to engage in the study material, which was intended to sort of enhance their awareness of various levels of racism, of positive aspects of Black identity. So we engaged with art, we engaged with, various types of literature. So the folks in the groups were willing to engage with that material, but very few engaged in external community-based actions that were related to racial advocacy or activism. This was a pilot study, small sample size, so not a ton of power to determine the actual mechanism there. But one hypothesis that we put out there for future research is that counselors aren't engaging in these behaviors as a function, maybe lacking clear messaging, practice, and precedent for activism as a core component of counselor professional identity. So this image here, this is a map from the Building Movement Project, and this is intended to help us leverage our strengths to create change. So if you just Google the Building Movement Project, you'll get access to this image, but also to descriptions of each of these different roles and ways that we can help to build efficacy. So related to engaging in activism, we want to think about our strengths, we want to think about our growth edge, and we want to think about our values. So strengths, that is kind of highlighted by these different roles that we might assume in order to engage in activism. If we think about our growth edge for white folks, this will likely involve seeing where we can get uncomfortable, examining what actions feel too scary, feel potentially damaging to our reputations, or otherwise just feel too bold. So if we check those out, in many cases, we'll see that we are clinging to privilege in some sort of way. So pushing that growth edge is going to require a lot of these skills that we've been talking about, a lot of willingness to introspect and a lot of mindfulness to engage in that process. For people of color, the growth edge may lean in the opposite direction. So if you feel like you are constantly educating other people about your lived racial experience, you're constantly in the fray of protest or legislative advocacy, then your work may be to rest, to explore some ways that you can pause and to see what is needed in that stillness. So obviously, this will be experienced to varying degrees depending on someone's lived racial experience. Okay, so now we're going to look at a couple of case examples, and we're going to break our responses down into 4 parts. So we're first going to breathe. So this is how we're going to engage that neuroceptive safety, potentially. Taking 3 deep breaths will not resolve trauma in any way, but it's going to demonstrate, how we might engage our parasympathetic nervous system. We're going to notice where we feel activated. Are we activated in privileged identities and marginalized identities? What does that feel like physically? Then we're going to consider the stakeholders in the scenario and their relative privilege, and then we're going to use that to choose a strategy that sort of most embodies this multicultural orientation and an anti-racist approach. Okay, so in our first case study, Your supervisee, a Black, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied female, is working with an Indian American college student. She shares that she had a family session with this client and her parents, during which the client's parents asked the supervisee to help communicate to their daughter why they were so upset by her choice to date a Black man. So first we pause. We take 3 breaths. And then just to name what shows up for me in that space, what gets activated is I definitely notice this sort of white savior urge. I notice an urge to go in and fix. I notice a sense of outrage for this supervisee. Yeah, so that's what I'm noticing that's predominant. So I'm going to make some space for that. And then if I think about the stakeholders, gosh, it's complicated here. So while we are generally instructed in counselor education as supervisors to really put our focus solely on the client of the supervisee, I feel like in moving in an anti-racist direction, we really have to be responsive to the relative privilege and marginalization of all the people involved. And so in this case, I feel pulled to offer the majority of my support to the supervisee in her marginalized Black female identity. So certainly it's really important to be collaborative about this rather than just be prescriptive, right? But what I did notice, and this was a true story, an actual interaction, was I noticed that as the supervisee was sharing this, she did kind of get kind of flat. And she was also having difficulty articulating what kind of help she needed around this. And I find that often to be an indicator that something has been activated. So when it's not a clear cut, I'm just not sure what skill to use here, or I'm not sure how to conceptualize this, or where we should go next, when it's just sort of a noticeable discomfort. And so the supervisee feels like, I've got to talk about this, but I don't know why. A lot of times it's because something has been activated. And so what we ended up doing was really just kind of pausing and taking some mindfulness, a mindful moment around it. And she was able to identify that what shows up for her is, I really do have to sacrifice myself in this scenario to support this client. So even though this client's parents have definitely microaggressed against me in my Black identity, my job is to just swallow that, stuff it down somewhere, and be supportive of the client. So we used a dialectical strategy there to say, okay, valid that you want to support your client. Let's look at the other side of this, which is what would it look like to not stuff down your sense of harm? And so the sort of middle path that we came to was that it made sense for her to set a boundary with this client, that she would certainly continue to work with the client, but it didn't really feel either workable for the supervisee or really meaningful for the client for her to continue to have interactions with the client's parent. And this also made sense because the client was an adult. So this was not a case where to set that boundary would have been harmful to the client. So I encourage you to pause and take a moment to kind of work through this yourself and see, especially if you go back to some of those techniques and interventions, to see what shows up as a possible direction to go, because that is certainly not the only way we could go about that interaction. Okay, so now we're going to look at a second case study. Same process. We're going to breathe. We're going to notice what's activated. And we're going to choose a strategy based on the stakeholders. So in this case study, your supervisee is a white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied female working in a high school setting. She reports that one of her students wants to begin testosterone treatments to affirm his male identity. The client, assigned female at birth, is 14 years old and reports that his parents are supportive of his name change, but are not supportive of gender-affirming care. The supervisee frequently uses she, her pronouns when referring to the client, and expresses concern that the student will regret taking permanent steps toward gender affirmation. So first we breathe. And then I'll name what shows up for me in this moment, which may be different than what showed up in the moment when it actually happened. I feel a real heaviness. I feel a little bit of rigidity, of like stuckness, like almost like words are stuck in my throat. So there's definitely a contraction that I feel around that. And I think what also shows up is, here we go again. White people never know what to do with identity differences. So I've got some judgment that shows up around that. So if we think about the stakeholders here, this one feels a little more clear cut to me, that really our work is to support this client who has multiple marginalized identities. I think a lot of times, I, at least because I work so much with adults, I often forget how vulnerable children are. I mean, I know children are vulnerable, but I mean, that as an identity is really critical to include here, along with this student's transgender identity. So in the actual process of working with this supervisee, we went, again, kind of a dialectical route with some ACT and some IFS language. So a question that I really like and that I use here is, how do you know what you know? So first we use this DBT strategy where we're saying, okay, it sounds like you're making some assumptions about maybe whether or not a child would understand or be aware enough about their gender identity to make a lifelong choice. And she affirmed that that is what she was feeling. Okay, so there's like this genuine concern. You don't want this person to feel regret. That's based more on developmental understanding. And so then the question is, well, how do you know what you know about that? Where did you learn that children at the age of 14, so teenagers, don't understand their gender identity? And so she was able to unpack that, oh, okay, actually that's because I interact with a lot of students and I don't have a lot of faith in their awareness. So rather than that coming from some space of wisdom, from some space of even sort of research-based knowledge, it was really just coming from a judgment place. So that created some space. So, okay, so now we're encountering that as a judgment. So what if we were to assume that actually what we do know developmentally is that by puberty, people are very aware of their gender? Another question you might throw in there is, okay, well, when were you aware of your gender in a way that felt, solid and confirmed? And then finally, we might just bring in some psychoeducation, right? Which is that there's some recent research actually that says that 98% of folks who undergo gender affirming care are not regretful. They continue within that gender identity for the remainder of their lives. So obviously that's a very powerful statistic, I think, in breaking down this judgment a little bit. Again, this is not the only way. I had a lot of redos in my head about how I could have done that differently. And so I encourage you to explore, what are some different routes that you might take to supporting this client by addressing the barriers to awareness within the supervisee. Okay, well, that is it, folks. I want to thank you for taking the time today to explore this topic. I am aware I have only scratched the surface of what is a deep and complicated and really critical aspect of supervision, but I hope that we can continue to face these challenges with courage and compassion. So thank you all.